evening. I want to thank Alan Banoff for the warm introduction and David Fishback for inviting me to speak with you tonight. I want to acknowledge my friend and colleague, Delegate Jeff Waldstreicher, who joins us with his wife, Joanna, and their children, Kate and Eli. And I especially want to acknowledge my wife, Mary, who's with us, as Alan said. As Alan said, we're your neighbors, and if you look out the front door of the Temple, you can literally see our house right across the street. Many of my constituents and friends are members, including John and Susan Gerson, Joe Rosenberg, Rachel Litvo, Susan Hoffman, and one of my mentors, Sharon Grossfeld. I've attended many meetings here and worked with Rabbi Stone and members of all ages on pedestrian safety. And I have great admiration for your work on issues of social justice and on the environment. I feel like I'm among friends. I grew up in a town called Cleveland Heights, Ohio, which had a large Jewish community. My family settled there in 1966 so that my dad, Dr. Al Carr Sr., could complete his residency in OBGYN after earning his medical degree here at Howard and providing care in the U.S. Army Hospital in Germany. The African-American population in Cleveland Heights in 1966 was less than 2%, and we were among the pioneering African-American families on the wave of suburban integration. Some of my earliest memories are of celebrating the Jewish holidays at the preschool that I attended in a local synagogue. As an adult, I fell in love with a wonderful Jewish woman who became my wife. At our interfaith wedding ceremony and reception, where our two families became one, after signing the ketubah, we took our vows under a book that now hangs in our house. I broke the glass and we danced the hora. Before I begin, I want to pay tribute to a Maryland legislator who passed away earlier this month. Royal Hart advanced civil rights during the King era. In 1967, he successfully championed legislation to repeal Maryland's 300-year-old ban on interracial marriage, making us the first state to do so, south of the Mason-Dixon line. And preceding the June 1967 Loving versus Virginia Supreme Court decision which ended these laws in 16 remaining southern states. This is a change that happened during my lifetime, and it built on Dr. King's work. As a Marylander who is in an interracial marriage, I'm grateful for Royal Hart. And in my own legislative career, I've been proud to continue to push for civil rights. For 3 years, I co-sponsored a bill called the Religious Freedom and Civil Marriage Protection Act, which would extend all the rights, protections, and responsibilities for civil marriage to same-sex couples. Senator Sharon Grossfeld was one of the first Maryland legislators to push for marriage equality, and support has grown every year since. Progress in Maryland has not been as quick as we would like, but with growing momentum from victories in other states, I look forward to the day when the idea of banning same-sex marriage seems as quaint and distant as the idea that we once banned interracial marriage. I think it is wonderful that we come together each year on Dr. King's birthday to remember and celebrate his contributions to our world. I'm not a King scholar, and my generation did not grow up during the civil rights struggle. I was a preschooler in 1968 when Dr. King died. I remember this because it was just a few weeks before my dad's death. We always kept a picture of Dr. King on the wall at our house, so his being taken from us stays emblazoned on my mind with my dad. In thinking about what I will share with you today, I remembered that my family had a personal connection to the King family. So I interviewed relatives to refresh my memory and get their perspective about his leadership and beliefs. In speaking with my mother, she reminded me that during the 1960s, Dr. King came and spoke to students at the junior high school where my grandmother, Dorothy Douglas, worked as the assistant principal. My grandmother made an audio tape of Dr. King's remarks that day, and after his death, she sent it to the King family to be kept in the archives at the King Center in Atlanta. In speaking with my aunt, Jan Douglas, who was active in the civil rights movement and knew the King family, she reminded me of the story of the time she sat next to Dr. King on an airplane. He asked for her opinion about his stance on the Vietnam War. This was during a time when some were calling for King to rights. Dr. King struck her as the type of leader who wanted to hear all arguments and all points of view before making up his mind. She thinks that President Obama has a similar style of leadership. I also spoke with my Aunt Benny Ivy, who was not my biological aunt, but is a close family friend. Benny was active in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and knew the entire King family. She worked for Dr. King's wife, Coretta Scott King, for many years. Benny shared that some people who knew his family well are frustrated at times that the Dr. King we know has been reduced to his brilliant "I have a dream" speech. It's the first thing people speak about, but only a fraction of who he was and is. Besides being a great orator, Dr. King was a scholar who wrote 5 books and published volumes of other writings. He was also a political activist who helped to get federal laws passed which affect all of us today. He was a father and a husband, and he was a spiritual leader who connected Eastern philosophy with Judeo-Christian traditions. As a result of King's successes in the civil rights movement, others were empowered to push for progress on many fronts, including the peace movement, the women's movement, and the gay rights movement. Benny told me that Coretta's favorite of his books was his last one, written just a short time before his death. But the book is titled "Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community?" I wanted to share a few things that I took away from the book after reading it. In the book, Dr. King acknowledges the frustration that many felt about the slow pace of progress on economic, social, educational, and political fronts. After early legislative victories, such as the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and judicial victories, such as Brown versus Board of Education. He talks about the imperative to continue on the path of using nonviolent techniques to achieve positive social change. He stresses the value of working together by building alliances and coalitions, rather than going it alone. He condemns the shameful evils of racism and anti-Semitism in no uncertain terms, and acknowledges that their contemptful ultimate logic is genocide. Dr. King hails the American Jewish community as voluntary, committed, and generous partners in the civil rights struggle, motivated by a cultural and religious commitment to justice. He dispels the myth that Jews attain greater social mobility and status because they have money. Rather, they progressed as a group because they had a tradition of education combined with social and political action. The last chapter of the book is titled "The World House," and in it Dr. King talks about the brotherhood of man and how we can best go forward in an interconnected world shrunk by technological change. He talks about the need to narrow the gap between scientific and material progress and moral progress. He illustrates the need for us to devote our will to addressing worldwide problems of poverty, hunger, overpopulation, and the lack of education, and talks about the urgent need to find alternatives to war and human destruction. Barry and I have 2 sons, aged 7 and 4, and 1 on the way. Our older son, Miles, has helped on my campaigns and followed the 2008 presidential election closely. He's at the age when he asks many questions about many subjects. With President Obama approaching the 1-year anniversary of his inauguration, Miles is aware and proud of his interracial and interfaith heritage. And I really have to think hard to find answers to his questions about why we have wars and environmental problems like global warming. And it becomes clear that we still have a ways to go in this country and in our world. But I see how far we've come toward living King's dream. Let us lift up the lessons and wisdom Dr. King shares in his writings and try to live by them. This is his treasure for us that will guide our efforts in the future to develop a more just, sustainable, and peaceful world. Thank you.